Hey folks, in this video, I want to address a question which everybody wonders about sometimes, and someone asked me about, so I thought I would briefly address it. And that is, can some arguments be both deductive and inductive? Can they overlap? Let me explain what I mean. Usually, when we're dealing with inductive and deductive arguments, or often anyway, there'll be keywords which help us to understand the nature of the inferential claim that's being made. So for example, in the red on the left, we see a classic deductive argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore necessarily Socrates is mortal. Now that word necessarily tells us that the intended inferential claim here is that the premises necessitate the truth of the conclusion. In other words, it's intended as a deductive argument. Contrast that with a classic inductive argument in blue on the right-hand side. 99 out of 100 marbles in the jar are blue. Therefore, the next marble drawn out of the jar will probably be blue. Again, that word probably indicates that the inferential claim being made is that the premises render the conclusion likely, probable. In other words, it's intended as an inductive argument. Now, here's where you might start to get confused. What if we don't have keywords? Because I could state those exact same arguments and just drop out the words necessarily and probably. And they would both still be easily discernible as deductive and inductive arguments, respectively. Now, how would I know that? Well, I'm just looking at the argument and I can tell the premises of the left-hand argument necessitate the conclusion, and the premise of the argument on the right renders probable its conclusion. So I very reasonably infer deductive and an inductive argument. Okay, here's where the questions start to arise, though. Are all valid deductive arguments also strong inductive arguments? Let me explain. If I've got a deductive argument, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, well, the premises necessitate the conclusion. Doesn't that mean that those premises make the conclusion 100% likely, 100% probable? And wouldn't that also make it like a maximally strong inductive argument? Okay, now in a sense that's true, right? But nobody talks that way. That is not how we treat these arguments in logic. When you see an argument whose premises necessitate the conclusion, don't treat it like a super strong inductive argument. You just call that deductive, okay? In that case, it's valid. Now, you might get even more confused when you start thinking about invalid deductive arguments. Are all invalid deductive arguments also just, are all invalid deductive arguments also inductive arguments? So let's take this one. All men are mortal. Socrates is a cat. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, this is not a valid deductive argument. It's an invalid deductive argument. But I think that we should still classify it as a deductive argument because the intent here is to offer a conclusion that is necessarily true. It just fails. But you might be asking yourself, well, why wouldn't we also just call it an inductive argument? And I might say, well, the premises don't even make the conclusion probable or likely. And you might reply, well, fine, it's a super weak inductive argument because it makes it 0% likely, but it's still a inductive argument, you might say. Now, if you want to push me in that direction and be like, okay, maybe so in a technical sense, it's also a super weak inductive argument, but nobody treats it that way. Don't think about it that way. Just treat it as a deductive argument that failed, an invalid deductive argument, because there's no indication it's even intended as a probabilistic argument. Now, on the other hand, you might ask this, aren't all strong inductive arguments also just invalid deductive arguments? So let's take back to our marbles again. 9 out of 100 marbles in the jar are blue, therefore the next marble drawn out of the jar will be blue. You might say, Sasser, that premise doesn't necessitate the conclusion. So it's not a valid deductive argument. Why not just call it an invalid deductive argument and also a strong inductive argument? Again, maybe that's true in some technical sense, but we don't talk about it that way in logic, right? We just treat it as an inductive argument, in this case, a strong one. So here's the bottom line. What you're trying to figure out when you look at an argument is what is the intended inferential claim, right? What is it most plausibly construed as intending to do? To necessitate the conclusion or to simply render it probable? And treat it as one or the other, not both. I hope that is somewhat helpful.